This is Winning IR, a podcast exploring the diverse insights within the IR community. Join me, Mark Fasken, as I sit down with IROs and other IR stakeholders to discuss the winning strategies, tactics, and shifts in thinking that are redefining the profession. Today's guest has advised on over 35 go-to-market transactions across IPOs, spins, SPACs, and traditional M&A. Alex Jorgensen is the managing director and head of investor relations at Prosek Partners and is responsible for leading the company's IR advisory practice. In 2020, he was named to Neary's 40 Under 40 list and currently sits on the committee of its New York Next Gen chapter. Alex has diversified IR and corporate communications experience that spans financial services, media and entertainment, technology, healthcare, and life sciences. I'm thrilled to be able to share his insights with you on this episode of Winning IR. Okay, so Alex, I wanted to kick the conversation off with sort of a foundational question, you could say. As a company, you've decided to go public. Is there a traditional team that you build for that process? And what are the primary components of it?
Hey, thanks, Mark. And just also want to, before I launch in, say thanks for having me today. It's a great question. And yes, the answer is absolutely. And what I always say is that there's what's optimal and there's what's realistic, right? And what's realistic is going to change for every company we work with. But what's optimal really is three components. You'll have a legal partner that you're working with, and there are so many SEC filings and so many SEC regulations that you need to navigate in the path to becoming a public company. That legal partner is crucial. You're going to be in the trenches with them. You're going to work with them. In addition to the legal component, there's obviously a banking component, right? At the end of the day, you're going public because you want access to capital, whether you're raising money through the IPO, whether you're doing an ADR because you want access to investors in a certain market, whatever path to becoming a public company you're taking. The short summary of why you're going that way is that you want access to capital. And so your banking team is crucial. And what I'd say about your banking team is that is as relational as anything. And the third component that really we're talking about today is the communications component. In my opinion, that component spans both public relations disciplines as well as investor relations disciplines. And you need both, because at the end of the day, if you have an extremely fundamentally sound IR strategy, you have an amazing narrative, but you don't know how to amplify that narrative, and you don't know what channels you can amplify that narrative through and around the regulations that were aforementioned, then you're going to leave some money and opportunity on the table. And so really that communications advisor is where I step in and where I partner with many companies. And what I'd say is the key difference between the other two components of the working group is that because you're going public, you're looking at a point in time, you're looking at a listing day, or you're looking at a specific fundraising moment in time, where we try to focus the companies we partner with, as well as the internal IR teams we partner with, is, are you thinking about your fifth earnings call? So after you're public, think through what it means in year two as a public company. And some of the things you're saying, both with your legal partners in SEC filings, as well as your banking partners when you're thinking about fundraising meetings and investor meetings, are those things setting you up for 2-3 years down the road? At the end of the day, when you list, a lot of your working group is going to retreat, and they should, right? Like those really big fees you're paying to go public are now behind you. You don't want to keep paying those really big fees. But you should have some sort of understanding and eye to the future. And ideally, where we at least fancy ourselves as partners, is that we actually stick around. We stick around with the companies that IPO, even if they have internal investor relations teams, for years to come.
Do you, not to jump ahead to a question we have a little bit later, but do you feel like that communications aspect and the sort of the positioning aspect is a place where companies often underinvest? I feel as though some companies are like, hey, we've got our results, we've got our story, the results speak for themselves, quote unquote. And sometimes that idea of the amplification and everything, it sometimes gets pushed to the side.
I agree with that. I think every company I've ever worked with desires the big broadcast interview the day they list. I think where companies maybe don't have the full picture from time to time is that CEOs aren't waiting in a line outside of CNBC the day they list, like to get on the air. It takes months and sometimes years of relationship building to get on these different broadcast opportunities. In addition to the broadcast opportunities, to your point, Mark, I think we need to make sure what you're saying in those forums square precisely to what you're saying in investor meetings. And if they don't, or if one feels disjointed, your audience is going to know that. And so it's not just, I really hope we can amplify this news. It's also, have we strategically thought about how this message is going to play in different forums? Yeah. You might say it differently in an investor meeting than you say it on Bloomberg TV, but the message could be the same across both.
Yeah, I really like that idea too of thinking 4 or 5 quarters ahead of is what we're saying now setting us up, or the things we're doing now setting us up for success in the future. I think that's great. So that's thinking around, okay, I'm in the process, right? It's happening.
Sure.
Maybe we take a step back for a second and let's put ourselves in the shoes of we're a company, IRO, CFO, maybe look at it from different perspectives. I'm like 9 months away from my IPO. What are some of the things that I should be thinking about beyond the team? We've covered that element of it.
I think it really comes down to one foundational document, and it's that prospectus. It's that S1, if it's an IPO, if you're looking at a SPAC or some sort of public merger or reverse merger, it's that S4 filing, and it's really building your box. And again, that team that we just described is going to be crucial because those are the different people who are thinking about this. But that communications partner can be really strategic because at the end of the day, your legal team is going to help you not violate any regulations. Your banking team is going to help you look at the competitive landscape and say, this is what other people have said. Your communications team is going to dig in with you and tell your story. And in those filings is the cornerstone of your narrative. If you are doing this effectively and you've built an S1 box that tells your story, it gives you a business overview, it looks at the competitive landscape, it takes a look at the growth strategy, and it also looks at your own competitive advantages. If it has those 4 components and it's fully baked, those 4 components are going to follow you throughout the rest of the IPO process. You're going to build your investor presentation for meetings with investors from those 4 components. You're going to build your talking points for media interviews. You're going to build anything you say in the public forum has to come from that document. So I would say 9 months out, I always say there are so many things you could be focused on. If you can give all your time to this filing and get it right, every other domino will fall, or we can spend less time on an investor presentation and get that right in a really short, window. But if we get the narrative wrong, the rest of it just doesn't work at the end of the day.
Is that narrative, a lot of these companies that are going public, most of them have been around for quite a while, right? They've been around for years already building their business. Is that narrative and building those documents, do you find that it takes like a very different perspective than what they're used to? Many of these companies have maybe gone through the process of raising money through private markets. Mm-hmm. Is it a drastically different exercise?
I think it is because private markets investors and public markets investors are different stakeholder groups. That is not to say that there are not crossover investors that do both, right? That are, in the, whether it's a PE firm or VC firm and investing in the private markets as well as the public markets. But I would say the majority of your audience is going to be unique to the public markets. And in that process, they're looking at your public peer group probably far more than when you were in your private raises. Yes, I think there are absolutely extremely valuable resources like FrontSpace and other things in the private market world that will help you build a peer group and a peer set and benchmark yourself against them during that fundraising process. It's ramped up to 11 when you go public because the likelihood is that you have, whether it's 3 or 20 direct competitors that are currently public, which means their filings are public, their financials are public, their strategy is public, and that is public record. And so an investor coming into that meeting maybe has done hours more homework on the competitive landscape. And so what you need to do is know your differentiators. You need to know how to tell your story. But one of the most common trappings we get into with management teams is I'm living and breathing and bleeding my story every day. We need to help them come up the altitude curve a little bit, go 20,000 feet in the air and say, okay, this is a generalist investor who might not even know my industry. I have to have a pitch that's salient with them, as well as an investor who just did all those hours and hours of homework that I just described. You're going to have meetings that are back to back where someone says, yeah, just walk me through your presentation. You're also going to have meetings where someone walks in with a legal pad and takes you to task on everything that your public
knows your business extremely well and your competitors and everything that they're doing. So it's almost like the level of detail that you may have to get into these meetings is going to be far beyond what you would have, because previously most of the investors you're speaking to, like we're talking about venture capital, they understand the industry, they understand the dynamics, but they're not digging into detailed financials with a lot of your peers like most public equity investors would be.
Absolutely. And there are going to be, you prepare for the worst, you hope for the best. There are going to be meetings where an investor absolutely just asks you to walk through your presentation and give you a really simple pitch, and they ask really simple questions and you walk out of that. The trick and the hardest part is the juxtaposition of it all. You just went through a 20-minute war across the table from someone who knows your business, feels like they know it better than you. And then you go into this meeting where the person's just ready to have a really leisurely conversation. Yeah. And you have to be able to transition really effectively and not be off your game or off your guard. It's funny because you hear about these long road shows in the IPO process, and it's 10 meetings throughout the day. These meetings range anywhere from 30 to 45. Sometimes they're an hour, but usually it's 30 to 45 minutes. And that doesn't sound like an absurd amount of time. You experience management teams that it looks like they just ran a race at the end of these meeting days because it's just grueling. Yeah. And you emotionally are just drained at the end of those days.
Yeah, I can imagine. Been there.
Absolutely. You've experienced it.
Sucks, right? Yeah. So maybe going and talking about the story, there's one other way I wanted to answer this question or ask this question is, as you go public, you have to also, it seems, explain why you're going public, right? There's one element of telling the story. Who are we? Explain your company and your story, but there seems to be another element of why are we going public? How do you suggest companies think about that?
It goes back to what we talked about in the first question, which is you want access to capital. And so we need a good reason for why you want access to capital. And then once we have that, we need to explore the route you're taking. Because ideally, that route is either solving a strategic need or is going to be your cheapest form of capital to raise in that moment. Now, in the most recent year, we've seen the IPO market effectively shut down, and that's because it stopped being the cheapest form of capital available. The most companies could go raise an awesome round with a private equity sponsor, and that would solve their needs. It would give them a lot of optionality. They wouldn't necessarily be beholden to all of the cost of going public, and that's great. But in 2021 and 2020, we saw record-setting numbers of companies going public. And to your point, Mark, I think a lot of companies did not think about, okay, we raised this money, what's on the other side of it? And why are we raising this money? And why now? And if the answer to why now is, it seems like a lot of companies are doing this right now, then we probably need to look at what is the deeper and longer term justification for going public. Some really great examples of this are, I've seen companies that pursued a SPAC transaction because it allowed them to combine two entities with the SPAC vehicle in one fell swoop and become a public company. Now that is unique to that transaction. It gave them access to capital because they eventually got access to the pipe round they raised in the SPAC transaction. They got access to the trust that the SPAC had raised, barring any redemptions in the shareholder vote. But they also merged in a transformative way with another entity and went public in one transaction. Now, that was complex. Every lawyer and banker I worked with on those transactions said, this is extremely complex. We wouldn't recommend everyone does this. But when you sat across from an investor and they said, why are you pursuing this route to market, particularly when there's so much conversation and conjecture around the quote unquote SPAC vehicle and SPAC bubble, that was a really strong answer that investors oftentimes didn't argue with, because they saw, oh, wow, this management team has thought through not just the access to capital piece, but the strategic nature of it. Now, on the IPO side, there's similar strategic reasons for that. The fact that as an IPO company, they will not only raise money in the IPO process, but have access to secondary raises. Many companies go public because they see 5 or 6 bolt-on acquisitions that they can make if they just have that pool of capital to deploy. And that's a great reason to go public. And that is an amazing thing to tout in your investor meetings from a strategic point of view. And so, yes, it's access to capital. Yes, is this capital strategic and cheap for a company? But it's also, what is your roadmap? You know, maybe it comes down to, you are an extremely successful company. You already have an amazing growth trajectory, but this capital is going to let you pay down debt. And in turn, you're going to expand margins in the next few years. There are so many ways to tell this story, and every company has a different reason. And it's key that you have a partner that can help you pull the right levers and figure out what your story is.
And it seems like, just given your points on the dynamics of the markets right now, it's only going to become more important that companies have a really solid why as they're going public. Because to your point, just saying we're just looking for access to capital is not going to be enough, because the question is then going to be, what are you going to do with it once you have it, right? It seems there's just more and more pressure moving forward. We've talked a lot about what companies should do, best practices, and how to build the team, thinking about the why are we going public, talking about getting that story and really understanding the competitive landscape and mapping that out really clearly. What about what companies shouldn't do, or areas where you've seen companies underinvest?
I think that it's a great question. I think that there's 2 areas, and they both relate to time. Companies that are going public, to your point, Mark, earlier in this conversation, you said they've been around for a few years. And as such, their CEO and oftentimes their CFO are maybe founders, maybe they're early employees of the company, or maybe they've just been there for this most recent chapter of growth and they've solidified their credibility within the organization. And so there's a lot of reverence given to these 2 positions, as there should be, by the way. That said, when we get to the fundraising point, to your question, Mark, earlier, a CEO and a CFO might feel, oh, I've done this before. I've raised private capital before. I don't need to practice my pitch. I don't need to practice a dry run for an investor meeting. I don't need to go over the do's and don'ts of investors. I'm not in grad school. That's the disposition, or that can be a really tough dynamic. And where I've often found the rubber meets the road, or where we come alongside companies, is maybe that internal team doesn't feel like they can say, we actually think you have 90% of your pitch down, but this 10% that you need to work on is going to be contingent on potentially hundreds of millions of dollars to this equity raise. And so let's get this right, even if it means 2 hours in a room. And having a third party that doesn't work at the organization can be effective and can be deployed for that purpose. And so it's not to be offensive. It's not to put any CEO or CFO in a situation where they feel like they're lesser than. It's more to say, hey, as a third party, from an objective standpoint, I think this can be stronger, and I think these are the ways to do it. Now, most CEOs and CFOs aren't CEOs and CFOs because they're not competitive. They're usually pretty competitive. And so they are, in sports, we always said, are you a gamer? Meaning practice, I could care less about. But when the lights are on, when the game's going, I'm a gamer. I can perform. And that's how a lot of management teams approach investor meetings. It doesn't matter. Don't take me through a dry run. When the lights are on, I'm going to shine. That's true in many instances. But where I've found very effective ways to navigate kind of management teams who maybe don't see the importance of prep is try to schedule a friendly with an investor. Try to make sure that the testing the waters meetings that your banking partners are setting up starts with a friendly that you know, and maybe has an hour-long break after it, so that the CEO and CFO can see maybe some of the limitations in their pitch. And if you can set up those friendly meetings, you can find a way to say, hey, you were there, you experienced this. I think this needs to be tighter. And if you can get to that point and everyone comes around the issue and really realize we're rowing in the same boat, let's all row in the same motion, that's where I've seen this process really hum. That's quite frankly where you get chills in the process. That's where you realize, holy cow, we just hit something that's going to define the next era of this company. And in turn, it's going to define the next few years for the folks I'm working with. And that's when it becomes super gratifying.
I think that's a great idea. And I know that there, even after going public, right, story changes, narrative changes over time. I've heard IROs talk about speaker training for CEOs and CFOs and things like that. And I think that's also an effective way of doing it. Of, hey, whether we're going whether doing an IPO or whether we've just got a new narrative that we're working on, that idea of doing those friendly meetings and having time to actually unpack it all and talk about next steps is a great idea. So you've done over 35 go-to-market transactions in the last few years. What are some of the most common challenges that you face other than gamer CEOs and CFOs?
Yeah, I would also caveat that if you've done go-to-market transactions long enough, you know that some baked into some of that number are transactions that didn't work out, meaning there are a lot of hours. There are many companies that are currently on file that are not in the IPO process, meaning they wrote an S1 or they did everything they needed to do to go public, but they're not going public. And so baked into that 35 number are a number of companies that are not publicly listed at this point in time, but went through everything, had a banking group, had legal partners, had communications advisors, and quite frankly, in a different world or in a different year would be a public company today, but market dynamics may have shifted that. I think that ultimately what has been common across all of those 35 transactions is that each one is unique and that each one has a different set of challenges as well as strengths. I will tell you that the most fun transactions I've worked on are not the easiest ones. And the challenges that we face, whether they're external or internal, are surmountable because we feel like we're a part of a team, meaning whether it's the banking group, the legal team, us, as well as the issuer, the filer, the company themselves, we all feel like we're a part of the same team. And when you feel like you're a part of the same team and that you're pursuing this together, even if it's complex, even if you face challenges, even if you totally drop the ball in an investor meeting, those are the ones that just are so much fun because you get, no matter what you do, these are going to be late nights. There's going to be challenges. I've never worked on a transaction where the CEO doesn't snap at me at least once. It's the nature of the beast. And if you don't have a thick skin and can't take that, then this isn't the line of work for you. But what I would say is that it's not personal. It's such an immense amount of pressure that these people are under. And if you look at this objectively, oftentimes these CEOs and these CFOs are thinking about such a big team of people that are supporting families and are supporting lives. And this path, becoming a public company, is actually providing a livelihood for an entire, sometimes thousands of people. And it's really powerful to think about. You don't want to overstate that or think about that for too long because then you end up navel gazing. But I do think that is what makes this line of work powerful. That's what makes this line of work. You get deep with management teams super quick. Without kind of that, what we already talked about, the kind of underselling the amount of prep needed, that is a relatively common stumbling block that I've faced. And then the other thing that I've seen is just companies that truly don't understand how much time this is going to take, how many nights this is going to take away from their family, this is oftentimes a 12 to 18 month process, even longer for IPOs, shorter for some of the reverse mergers or SPACs. But you try to cancel your holidays that year, you cancel your vacations that year, you're going to miss some stuff with your family. And that takes a toll on people.
Yeah. And I think to your point, you just really got to be committed to the process. You got to understand what you're getting yourselves into. You got to be able to deal with that pressure. I imagine you spend a lot of time sort of shepherding people through that process, being the shoulder to cry on at times, or the punching bag, either one.
Yeah, I think both hands is the answer to that. Yeah. But I also think that if you can take a step back and just have empathy in your role, Mark, we both lead teams. There are plenty of days that I guarantee I'm not the best leader I could be. And in the same regard, no one is immune to that. And if anything, I think that these executive teams and management teams are under even more pressure than what I've faced. And so if you can have that empathy and still toughen your chin, speak truth to power, it's not your job to just accept what a management team tells you to do. It's your job to tell them what you think is best practice and really advise them strategically. Then I think there's just you emerge from those conflicts and from some of those things just so much stronger. And you have really deep relationships with CEOs and CFOs that you might not even work with them directly after the IPO or SPAC. They'll call you 24 months down the road when they have a really sticky situation, and you get to work with that. And those relationships are forged in the IPO process.
For sure. So I have two more questions. One of them is off the back of a comment that you actually just made around some of those companies who didn't go public because the market dynamics just weren't right. And so timing seems to be a big part of the IPO process and getting it right. Seems like you feel that it's an important part of the decision-making process. But anything else you want to add? Do you think that a company can overcome timing issues? You look at the market now. Do you think that a company that really has their stuff together, has a really solid story, that they can overcome those timing issues, or do you think it's just, no, you still should wait it out?
I think that it comes down to exactly the themes that we've been talking about: access to capital and what is the most efficient way to raise that capital. And so at the end of the day, there are companies that are going public in this environment. There are spinoffs. There are a number of ways that companies are finding paths to becoming public companies that are unlocking value. And in that case, yes, people can go public in today's environment. If someone or a company is looking to go public and they truly can raise the same amount of capital in the private markets, it's their fiduciary duty to explore that. And so I think you saw this a ton in 2017, 2018 time period. Companies were dual tracking their fundraising process. So they were preparing to go public, they were preparing to IPO, and they were also stopping opportunities in the private markets, or they were acquisition targets for much larger public companies. And in some instances, you saw companies that were set to go public that in a certain week that announced a transaction in which they were being acquired that exact same week. And that was such an interesting time. And when you work on a transaction like an IPO, it can be deflating when you're in my seat. Oh, we worked so hard for this and it's all for naught. But at the end of the day, hopefully it always goes back to making sure that it's right for the company, because if it's right for the company, then it's probably right for the management team, the employees of that company, most importantly, the stakeholders of that company. And if you can find a way to raise capital in a more efficient manner than going public, listen, most companies are going to explore that route, because being a public company isn't just expensive when you go public, it's expensive to stay public. The amount of time you need to spend around SEC filings and earnings calls. And if you can avoid those, I completely understand why management teams would. So the answer is yes. It all comes down to access to capital and what's the most efficient way to gain that access.
It's a good point. Almost as a follow-on to your point about understanding the time it takes to actually go public, but that's the second part. Not everybody thinks about, okay, now I am.
Right.
What are all the things I need to do? All of the reporting and everything. It's a lot.
And you saw that in 2021, so many companies went public, and we saw this last year when the market turned, all these companies were public, and whether it was profitability guidance that companies were giving, that was just totally off because they underestimated the cost of being a public company. And management teams had to reckon with their ability to lead their own companies, because I don't think a lot of people gave the reverence required to being a public company. And that's a weird word to put around it, the reverence around it. But it really comes down to the way I always look at this is I'm helping people create jobs, which in turn is going to fuel the lives of families. And so if you don't have reverence for that, then I think you're going to hurt a lot of people.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing to me that I think you need to consider, especially in this line of work.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great way of thinking about it. Last question, and it does go back to something you mentioned earlier, which is doing what's right for the various stakeholders. You're managing a lot of different expectations and audiences as you go through this process, the employees, investors, a bunch of different stakeholders. So how do you recommend companies manage those different expectations and audiences and stay focused on the task at hand?
Meaning, if you were to take every stakeholder that this process impacts, the list would be pages long, right? Whether it's you have partners, customers, vendors, employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think it really comes down to a lot of times, I rarely need to have this conversation with management teams. if a management team is in this position, most of the time, they're there because they're extremely ambitious and they're extremely competent and they're extremely talented. And so they don't really need pep talks in many ways. But I think it all comes down to the track record that got you there. Even if it's a short acceleration, meaning you're a tech company that didn't exist 5 years ago, but you did something, you had an idea, and you executed well enough to get to here. And if that's the case, then it's not just about your company going forward, it's about your go-forward team. And if you can build the right team around you, then you can accomplish anything. And I think that the hardest part, to your point, Mark, is the overwhelming feeling that the world is on your shoulders. But public companies, despite lawsuits and how those end up coming down, public companies are never one person. It's a lot of people. It's a group of people, and it's a lot of decisions by committee. And we started this conversation by talking about the team that you would build to go public. You need to build a team to go public. You need to build a team to stay public. And don't underestimate that. And if you don't underestimate that, then you can let some of the stuff fall by the wayside, and you can get a little more zen about it and think about, okay, I have a team that I trust. Therefore, I can't worry about every single thing. In our early conversation, we were talking about people who go from managing a team of 10 to managing a team of 10,000. Inevitably, their management style is going to change throughout that evolution. But at the end of the day, their team should change with it. And if their team is something that they trust and full of people they trust, then I think they can surmount the challenges that come their way. But I agree. I think it is an overwhelming prospect, and it should be. I think we have a conversation with every management team when they're going public. And my colleague, David Wells, who recently passed away, taught me this, is the day that a company goes public, the day they list, pull the CEO aside and just tell them to enjoy it. Because if they do this, they probably are going to do this once. Maybe they do it a few times. But they better enjoy it. And if they do that, their team is going to enjoy that. And if their team enjoys it, they're going to be motivated to do the right thing. They're going to be motivated to continue to work and be led and be stewarded by this person. And most importantly, they're going to set this company up for years and years of shareholder value creation and stakeholder value creation.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's interesting, like so much of this conversation, just to wrap it together, I think it really comes down to, in summary, setting that vision and that narrative early on, making sure that you have the right team in place to support that narrative and that vision, and that there's the right people in place to also give you the feedback and that direct feedback that you need to adjust your approach, but making sure that everybody's rallying around that vision so that maybe if there are questions or doubt or hardship as you go through that process, you have that clear vision, you have that clear narrative, and everybody can keep helping each other in the right direction. It seems like that team is such a core piece of it.
That's exactly right. And really viewing it as a team is how you get through it. Because if you try to carry this burden alone or with a discounted team, you're going to miss something, or you're going to make a knee-jerk decision that you don't need to make. You can make a much more clear-headed one with a team.
That's awesome. Alex, thanks so much. This has been great.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Winning IR. For more winning ideas, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Irwin, a better way to manage investor relations. For more information, visit www.getirwin.com.